So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's give her a warm FDIC welcome.
Thanks, sir.
Yeah.
A few years ago, I got this letter in the mail. I guess I knew it was coming, but it was a shock to the system nevertheless. I'm just going to read it to you. From Commander, Naval Personnel Command to Captain Karen L. Baetzel. Subject, retirement order and transfer to the retired status. You have reached mandatory retirement date, and the Secretary of Navy has authorized your transfer to the retired reserve. Enclosure 1 is your certificate of retirement. Your dedicated service to the Navy and your country is deeply appreciated. May you enjoy every success in the future and happiness in the future. P.S. You can keep the jacket. Middle age sneak up on anybody else in here? I joined for 4 years, and 30 years later, I get a letter saying, go home. So now I'm at this place, like the Wizard of Oz scarecrow at the crossroads, and I'm looking down the yellow brick road, and I don't know what I'm going to do. So my daughter pipes in and says, well, it's pretty obvious to me, Mom. Number one, you're a little bit too young to sit down on the rocking chair and wait for your Colonial Penn life insurance policy to pay off. You are too honest to steal. You have to go get a job. And I'm thinking, holy cow, I haven't had a civilian job since disco was king. What am I going to do? What is it that I am going to do? You know how grown-ups are always asking little kids, what are you going to be when you grow up? What are you going to be when you grow up? What are you going to be when you grow up? And the truth of the matter is, we don't care what they're going to be when they grow up. We're looking for ideas for ourselves. So I decided that my next chapter was going to be about paying my mortgage. Now, I mentioned I'm from Miami, so it's not that mortgage that I'm trying to pay. I'm not underwater down there. I'm trying to pay the mortgage of the investment that this country made in me for 30 years. And I thought I would share what I learned in those 30 years, which was so valuable. So I go around and I speak and train and work with people on things like leadership and honor and courage, commitment. So that's what I'm doing for my next chapter of life. This is what I'm doing when I grow up. Trouble is, I will live 2 lifetimes and never repay this back. But with your kind indulgence today, I'm going to take an opportunity to whittle away at my principle a little bit with you. First thing I'd like to do is define some terms. Cockpit is a place where communication, precision communication is critically important. And I think it's important here that we define some terms that I'm going to be using. The first one I'm going to talk about is the term veteran. And we had a veteran roll call already, and I love those. I look forward to them every year. But let me just ask you, if you understand the etymology of the word veteran, it comes from Latin. Its origin word is letus, L-E-T-U-S, letus. It means old. Okay, how many veterans are in the room now? But the dictionary definition of it is that it's one who served in the military. Another definition is someone who's long practiced or experienced. So we're going to use that as our starting place. The second word I kind of want to clarify with you before we go any further is the word honor. It's a very interesting word. It's interesting because it's both a noun and a verb. As a noun, it means a privilege. Like it's my privilege, my honor to speak to you today, and I'd like to thank Millie Johns for inviting me. It's an honor to be here with you as a noun. But honor is also a word of action. It's a verb. It means to keep a promise. In its action sense, it means to keep a promise. And that's very, very important. And the third word, and I think the most complicated, is that of hero and its corresponding heroism. I think in today's culture, it's very easy to confuse fame and celebrity with heroism, and they are not the same thing. While I hear sports figures or movie stars referred to as heroes, I cringe. I absolutely cringe. And while they may be excellent at what they do, most of them could not hold a candle to a real hero. But let's talk about the definition of hero in the Oxford Dictionary. The definition of hero in the Oxford Dictionary starts like this: usually a man. Millie, do we have work to do or what? Usually a man. Okay, we might want to work on that. But it's an individual possessing courage, someone of outstanding achievement, or possessing noble qualities. It's from the Greek. It means defender or protector. And if you don't like that definition, we can always go to the second one, which is submarine sandwich. We're going to work on the hero definition, the first one. Someone possessing courage, someone possessing noble qualities. And those noble qualities might include things like integrity, competence, teamwork, effectiveness, accountability, and fairness. Let me run them past you again. Integrity, competence, teamwork, effectiveness, accountability, and fairness. Anybody recognize those heroic virtues? Somebody in the back does. What are they? Yes, they are your core values. Did you know that the FDIC is calling you to heroic virtues? So I'm going to do my best to honor these big words, important words. They're not always easy to discern, particularly heroism. So I'm going to take the approach that Justice Potter Stewart took with pornography. It's hard to define, but I know it when I see it. And the first thing I know about heroism is it doesn't arrive with a parade. The parade comes afterwards. Heroism does not arrive with a parade. I'm going to share you 4 short stories. And you could pull the first slide up, please, Andrew. I'm going to tell 4 short stories. And I want to make one thing perfectly clear before I start. Despite the fact that I am a naval aviator, these are not lies. These are real people. These are real people, not composite people, that I have had the pleasure to bump up against in 30 years of service. And I'm going to go about this in a Forrest Gump sort of style. These stories embody what I've come to believe are hallmarks of true heroism and have left an indelible mark on my soul. And the way I honor them is to share them with you. My hope is that you'll come away from this thinking as I do, that we often walk among heroes unaware. The first hero I met was in a galaxy far, far away. Actually, it wasn't a different galaxy at all, but it might as well have been. I'm a country girl from up the road in Frederick County, Maryland. And when I went into the recruiter's office, he said, "What do you want to do in the Navy?" And I said, "I want you to get me as far away from here as you can." That's all. And he obliged. My first duty station was Japan on a joint staff, and it meant it included all branches of the service. I was a brand new ensign on a very senior staff, and I was the only really, really junior officer. And I had this job called protocol officer, which is kind of a combination of a bellhop and a golf caddy and a hotel concierge. I was like a little mini Travelocity, where I helped all the visitors to the Far East that came through our headquarters, do the logistics of their visit. What this job did, however, was give me access at a very tender professional age to hear and talk to extraordinarily important senior leaders. And I learned so much. Now, there were 6 very senior department heads on this staff, and the deputy was an Army 2-star general, and the big chief was an Air Force 3-star. And as you might expect on a joint staff, there were service rivalries. The Army guys and the Navy guys and the Marines all kind of butt up against each other, and the Air Force guys, and everybody's kind of in their own little clique. And as part of this service rivalry and fun, the Army general decides he's going to gather up all his colonels, and he's going to trot them all upstairs and sing happy birthday to the 3-star Air Force general. Now, one of those colonels that he was going to round up for his little song fest was Colonel Hatch. I liked him immediately. For one thing, he was irreverent. And you know when you're young and you see an older person that's kind of a little bit of a rebel, you kind of love them because it's like, wow, I can grow up and be like that too. And he never took himself too seriously. He did radiate a sort of strength, but he was approachable. He was the chief of the intelligence department, and he was in charge at the, let me give you an example of his reverence. He was in charge of a joint U.S.-Japanese intelligence initiative. They were opening a joint U.S.-Japanese intelligence center, and that was one of his big tasks. And the very senior officers decided that it needed a really catchy code name. Now, it was a joint U.S.-Japanese intelligence center. Colonel Hatch wanted to call it the Joint U.S.-Japanese Intelligence Center. But the senior officer said, no. We want a really catchy code name, because after all, this is the intelligence world. And they picked the name Fierce Wind as the name of this project. And he took great delight in informing them at a large staff meeting that the Japanese translation of their catchy code name, Fierce Wind, was actually Breaking Wind, and they ought to reconsider. So back to the birthday song. The Major General was fixated on getting his colonels to run upstairs and sing to the Air Force General. He thought it was an expression of Army pride and esprit de corps and all that stuff. And all the other Army colonels thought it was dippy, but they were willing to go along, and get it over with, but not Colonel Hatch. At the appointed time, he didn't go to the general's office to sing. And now we have a larger issue. The Major General was frosted. He called Colonel Hatch into his office and said, "Dick, did you not get the time to go upstairs and sing to the general?" And Colonel Hatch said, "Yes, I did, but I'm not going to do that." The general said, "Are you refusing a direct order?" And Colonel Hatch said, "Yes, sir, I am." And the general said, "What are we going to do about that? I could have you court-martialed for that." And Colonel Hatch said, "I don't know what you're going to do, but I bet one of us is going to look pretty silly at my court-martial." Turned around and walked out of the office. To my young eyes, that was real courage. Little did I know. While this petty drama was the buzz of the staff, I learned a little bit more about Colonel Hatch. I guess I didn't notice, until it was called to my attention, that he walked with something of a stiff gait. It was because he had a prosthetic leg. You see, I thought Colonel Hatch was brave for facing down the two-star over some silly birthday song. What I did not know at the time was when he was my age, he was on Hill 255. Hill 255 was a tactically and strategically worthless piece of real estate, then and probably now. It was one of several small hills about 300 meters high, and they served as exposed outposts, defended usually only by a single company or platoon. Between 1951 and 1953, it was traded several times between Communist Chinese, North Koreans, and South Korean and American forces. In the spring and summer of '53, the fighting was particularly brutal, bloody, and militarily pointless. Hill 255, you may know as Pork Chop Hill. It was used as an arena on both sides to make political statements and gain leverage for the negotiations of the armistice. And young men on both sides paid a dear price for what we would call today, here in Washington, the optics of it all. Between April and July, 347 Americans died, and 1,289 were wounded over that worthless piece of Korean ground. And Colonel Hatch was one of them. He left his leg on Pork Chop Hill, and his career as an infantryman was over. So he switched branches to intelligence. Some 25 years later, he impressed this young ensign with what she thought was a display of courage over singing Happy Birthday. Taking a page from Forrest Gump, Colonel Hatch taught me that courage is as courage does. Next stop in my Forrest Gump odyssey was Navy Flight School, where I brushed up yet again against a hero unaware. Any Navy aviators in the room? Any aviators from other services? Flight school is an exercise in fear. That's the thesis statement. For most of the time, you're preoccupied with staying alive, both literally and figuratively. You don't want to wash out and you don't want to kill yourself. The average flight student is terrified of their flight instructor. Terrified. And your flight instructor is only 1 or 2 pay grades senior to you, but you're still terrified of them. And the very idea of interacting with your commanding officer is coming face to face with the Almighty. It is terrifying. my primary helicopter squadron, my commanding officer was Commander Clyde Lawson. When I first saw him, he was about the most unscary guy you could imagine. Commander Lawson was a slightly built man, small really. We probably could have fit in the same size flight suit. This is him right here. He's a real average looking guy. In my self-absorbed survival mode, it wasn't until somebody told me what he was doing when he was a lieutenant junior grade. He was at sea aboard USS Preble off the coast of North Vietnam. On the night of 19 June 1968, he was asleep in his rack. But another crew was busy. An F-4 crew off the USS America was on a 3-plane night raid on what was known as the Pouncer missions, where they sent 2 fighters and an A-6 bomber with sophisticated detection devices and equipment on board, seeking enemy transports that typically traveled at night. The mission was deep over North Vietnamese territory in an area crawling with enemy soldiers, hostile civilians, and known for heavy concentrations of ground-to-air artillery. One of the F-4s took a hit from a SAM, and that ended its mission. The pilot, Lieutenant Commander John Holtzcraft, expressed it in a way that has become famous in naval aviation. He said, "I realized we were done flying. We were out of altitude, out of airspeed, and out of ideas." So the wake-up call came after midnight to the Preble, and Lieutenant J.G. Lawson and his crew of the UH-2 Sea Sprite, affectionately known in the Navy as a hooky toot, were called to duty. Now, the UH-2 Sea Sprite is a single-engine, smallish helicopter, and like Commander Lawson, it is not very big and not very scary-looking. And the call sign of Commander Lawson's aircraft was, and I am not making this up, Clementine. Not Mad Dog, not Bonsai, not Viper, Clementine. The F-4 crew had survived ejection. They were on the ground alive but injured, and they were surrounded by North Vietnamese, and they needed a pickup. Can you imagine what they must have been thinking there, scrambling through the jungle, when the reply for their pickup was, "Don't worry, we're spinning up the hooky toot. Clementine's on the way." It's like, oh, great. Well, Lieutenant J.G. Lawson might have been a small man in stature, but he was a big pilot. He flew 70 miles into the crash site, and the North Vietnamese were waiting. Evading SAMs himself, he proceeded to the crash site, and they attempted to use the penetrator, which is a sort of a hoist, to get into the dense jungle to pick up the crew. While the overhead aircraft provided illumination flares, the downed crew and the helicopter made 5 unsuccessful attempts to locate each other. Clementine took small arms fire and sustained damage as she was penetrating the jungle canopy. At the same time, the downed aviators were within yards of North Vietnamese soldiers, who were just as frantically trying to capture them as they were frantically trying to evade. After the last illuminating flare died, it looked pretty bleak, but Lieutenant J.G. Lawson decided to make one more attempt, this time in a different way. Rather than trying another hoist extraction, he simply landed in an open rice paddy, keeping just enough lift on his helo to avoid sinking into the mud. And then he turned his landing lights on. Picture everyone else playing a deadly game of hide and seek, and you turn your lights on and honk your horn. With the other 3 crew members suppressing fire on the enemy, Lieutenant Commander John Burns and John Holtzcraft sprinted to Clementine and scrambled aboard. And with it, they avoided the sure hell that would have been the North Vietnamese prison camp. Lieutenant J.G. Lawson took off out of the mud and headed to sea, and landed aboard USS Jouett with 5 minutes of gas left. No Bruce Willis movie will ever compare to this drama, and I invite you to read the full account. It's worth it. He was the first naval aviator to receive the Medal of Honor in the Vietnam War, and he was my mild-mannered skipper, flying an airplane called a hooky toot with the call sign Clementine. For the remainder of his naval career, including his time as my CO, he seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention to his amazing story of heroism. He remarked that he never thought he deserved the Medal of Honor because he thought that's what the Navy was paying him to do. Thought about that a great deal over the years. takes me back to the scene when Forrest is in boot camp and his drill instructor says, "How could you build your rifle so fast?" And he says, "Because you told me to, First Sergeant." According to Commander Lawson, he was a hero because the Navy told him to be. Next brush with a hero came a couple of years later, and it involved someone doing exactly the opposite of what he was told to do. It occurred on board USS Abraham Lincoln, CVN 72, homeported then in Alameda, California. We were cruising off the coast of Northern California on a short cruise, doing routine operations, working up the crew in preparation for a full deployment. First, let's talk a little bit about an aircraft carrier. Any carrier sailors in here? All right. All right. These guys will back me up on this. An aircraft carrier, how many folks have even been a visitor on an aircraft carrier? Oh, good. So you have a little idea of what I'm describing. It's hard in words to describe the majesty of an aircraft carrier, how big it is, how awesome it is. It's an enormous floating city, is what it is, and it's got a population of about 5,000 people when the air wing is embarked. And what's most amazing, and I tell this to Americans every time I get a chance, the average age of a sailor on an aircraft carrier. An aircraft carrier's average age is about 23 years old. But up on the flight deck, up on the roof, it's more like 19. It is stunning to me to realize that an aircraft carrier, when you get right down to it, is a heavily armed, nuclear-powered college dorm. I mean, it is manned by teenagers. And that flight deck is one of the most dangerous places in the world. Now, on the flight deck, the flight operations are always recorded and beamed throughout the ship onto monitors in the public spaces. So you can see flight deck operations going on. So there we were on the coast of Northern California doing routine work ops, and we're doing night ops. Now, if you think it's dangerous during the day on the flight deck, it's double down, triple down, 3 times over at night. It's a very, very dangerous place. And just, oh, by the way, the deck itself is some 90 feet from the surface of the water. And it's moving, oh, by the way. 90 feet from the surface of the water. Now, like all Navy ships, around the edges of the flight deck, there's netting. It's about maybe 8 feet with some really sturdy netting, and hopefully, if anybody falls off the side or gets blown into it, they'll get caught in the nets and they can scramble back on board. So, 90 feet off the water. So, that night, while routine night operations, one of the young men on board the flight deck gets too close to the jet blast of a turning aircraft, and he gets blown off the ship. Right over the nets, right past the railing, and over 90 feet to the cold Pacific water. And we could see it. Immediately, man overboard, everybody in the ship knows exactly what's going on. We do a muster. I mean, everybody knows flight ops are suspended, and we're trying to now pick a young sailor up out of the water. While watching what's going on the flight deck, guess what else happens? The young kid standing right beside him, in defiance of every bit of training, every bit of common sense, every bit of logic, goes right over the side after him. Now, I'm not going to keep you in suspense. The good news is that whenever there's flight deck operations going on, we have a search and rescue team either turning on the deck, fully running, or it's in a pattern beside the ship. So if there's any accident or anybody falls overboard, the SAR bird can pick them up within a matter of minutes. And that's what happened this night. After about 7 minutes in the water, both young men were recovered, and thank God, 19 years old, they're invincible, they survived, and they were none the worse for wear for their trip over the side. But here's the rest of the story, and the question I want you to ask yourself, because I ask myself, Why in the world did that second sailor go over the side after his shipmate? And here's what he said. Because it looked to me like he might have hit his head on the net rail on the way over, and I was worried that he couldn't get turned over in the water. Now, what these young men wear is a float coat, or young men and women. They wear a simple saltwater activated, what's called a float coat. It's a simple plastic vest, and when they hit the water, the salt water inflates, or the salt water activates the inflator, and it inflates. But it does not, if you'll notice, have any way of supporting your head. It'll keep you on the surface of the water, but it will not keep your head out of the water. So if you're injured or unconscious, and you can't right yourself, you can't turn yourself over, you're going to drown. You'll drown on the surface, but you'll drown. So sailor number 2 thought he saw his shipmate hit his head on that railing that holds the net and said, I was worried he couldn't get turned over. So I went in after him. So, was this kid a lifeguard, captain of his high school swim team, something like that, had hero fixations? Here's the rest. The kid who went over the side was a third-class Navy swimmer. Now, I hear a couple chuckles in the audience because you may know what that means. That means you are a rock. Okay, there's no lower qualification in the Navy than third-class swimmer. You have to be a third-class swimmer to serve on board a ship. So this was a swimming rock, a third-class kid who knows how to activate his equipment. That's about the level of a third-class swimmer's proficiency. And he still went over the side at night, 90 feet to the water, after a shipmate. And it might be worth it to note that there's nothing in this outfit that's a wetsuit. It's basically a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. Nevertheless, over the side he went. So this lousy swimmer went at night, 90 feet to a cold Pacific Ocean to save a shipmate. On those concern, devil may care, on his own safety, that he might not be able to get turned over. So I'll tell you, if anybody badmouths today's teenagers in front of me, I might just throw them off a flight deck and see what happens. The last brush with a hero, I will tell you, was my most soul-searing, however. As punishment for all the fun I had in the cockpit, my last tour of duty was in the Pentagon as payback. Anybody work in the Pentagon? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Lots of paper shuffling. Lots of looking back and saying, wow, it was really fun out there doing operational things, but now I'm here in the big house. But one day I was sitting there at the Pentagon and I'm moving stack A of papers to stack B papers to stack C papers. And the boss comes out of his office and he said, I'm going down to Walter Reed to visit wounded today. In your introduction, you might have heard I served in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense. And this was a deputy came out and he said, I'm going to go visit wounded today. Does anybody want to go along? I said, you bet, I do. So we went down to Walter Reed. Now, as coming out of the Office of Reserve Affairs, he had a special mission to visit reserve and guard soldiers that had been injured. As mentioned earlier, we're doing unprecedented things with our guard and reservists that we've never done before, especially in the last 10 years. They got their shoulder under both wars for a significant, much greater than they've ever been used before. So we're making a special trip down there to visit the guard and reserve soldiers that were injured. I can't go into all the details of that visit. The time doesn't permit. I will tell you, we visited 7 men that day, and I was so struck by what I saw that I had to come out, sit down, and write down every detail of every person that we visited that day, because I never wanted to forget this. Never wanted to forget what I saw that day. The last guy we visited, I'm going to tell you a little bit about. He, like so many soldiers over there, was hit by an IED in a vehicle. He lost his right leg below the knee, his left leg above the knee. He lost one arm, about halfway up to the elbow, one hand. He lost sight in his eyes. And he had took sufficient concussion to the head that he had brain damage, and there was cognitive impairment. So I want you to think about that. Both legs, one hand, his vision, and cognitive impairment. It's pretty hard to see. I'm not a medical person, but it doesn't take much imagination to think that this young man will never see life outside a skilled care facility. He just was simply hurt too bad. And despite the fact that he had brain damage and cognitive impairment, he was still very verbal and actually very animated. And he knew we were there, and he was talking to us and carrying on a lively conversation. It didn't always make sense, but he was there. I mean, there was somebody talking there. But he's not really the one this story's about. There in the room with him was his wife of 18 months, holding his 2-week baby daughter. She was 21 years old. While the deputy was talking to the soldier, I walked over to the girl holding her baby. I said, "How are you doing?" And she smiled at me, about $1 million smile. And she said, "I'm doing good." And I looked at the baby and cooed over the baby a little bit, and I said, "Tell me about the baby." And he goes, "Well," she said, I try and come down every day. Try and bring the baby every day because it seems to make him so happy. He loves to hold her. He loves to have her in his arms. He loves to feel her. And so we're doing good. We're doing good. When I looked at that 21-year-old woman holding and cooing over that baby and showing this child and sharing this child with her grievously injured 23-year-old husband, when I saw her smile and her composure and her focus on making the best of her day with her family, I realized I know nothing about courage. When many people would have collapsed in the face of that devastation and adversity, she took the day as it came and took the universe for what it gave her and moved on without fear. I think I quite possibly met the toughest woman I will ever meet in my life, and she was 21 years old. Just like Pork Chop Hill, North Vietnam, the flight deck of a carrier, or a hospital room, we walk among heroes unaware. So where do we get these people? Where do we get such heroes? And I'll tell you, it's easy. We grow them and we import them. Our downfall has been predicted since the 60s, if you're paying attention. How many duck and cover kids in here? All right, some of you know what that means, right? It's hard to believe for you young whippersnappers out there. We actually did drills in elementary school, hiding under our desks in case the Soviets nuked us. And then in Germany and Japan were going to bury us in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And then Y2K was going to kill us at the turn of the century. And the 24-hour news cycle does nothing but perpetuate this diet of doom and gloom. And I will tell you, it would be intellectually dishonest to say that the events of 9/11 haven't also added to our fear cycle and our despair cycle. But come on, let's take a look at the dashboard here. 17 of the 50 largest companies on earth are right here in the good old USA, 3 times more than the next on the list, which is the UK. 90% of the world's computers use Microsoft. Apple dethroned Sony and never looked back. McDonald's in 120 countries. 70% of Coca-Cola is drank outside this country. Not impressed with our consumer goods? Okay. How about our brain power? 6 of the top 10 universities, and 14 of the top 25 universities are in the United States. And that's not our list, that's a British list. We account for 1/3 of all international patents, more than twice in second place Japan. Our GDP is equal to the entire EU, and that's composed of 27 different economies. Oh, but wait a minute. China's going to bury us now. China, GDP, our GDP is double that of the largest economy on earth, and we do it without poisoning our land or our people, without enslaving our children, and with 1/5 of the workforce. There's no middle class. There's a government that breeds toxic distrust over trading partners. There's no transparency. There's no protection of labor, and there's no corruption fighting mechanism. And how about this? The immense gap in per capita income between our two countries, I don't care how you cook the books, we still have about an 8-to-1 advantage. And notice, I didn't mention human rights, little baby girls, or freedom. We dominate the Nobel Prize Awards, and half of our Nobel laureates are immigrants. And how about this? This is a place where a biracial child born to an 18-year-old hippie girl and an absentee dad, and these are the president's own words, not mine. There's no disrespect intended there at all. But an 18-year-old hippie girl and an absentee dad, and he is now the leader of the free world. And the other leader of the free world, Oprah, born in Mississippi poverty with a childhood story that is not very pretty, rocks the world every time she turns around. Adlai Stevenson put it this way: America is much more than a geographic fact. It's a political and moral fact. The first community in which men set out, in principle, to institutionalize freedom, responsible government, and human equality. So how do we do it? Well, Jim Rohn said that civilization is the intelligent management of human emotion. Here in Washington, D.C., arguably the greatest seat of power, we know there's several levers to that power: diplomatic, economic, political, military. I touched upon our economic power. You're in the business, you know what that means. But let's take a look at our military power. Even at the height of the British Empire, no one has ever dominated the military spectrum like we do. We are in space and at the bottom of the sea, and everywhere in between. We have tanks as fast as cars, satellite-guided weapons, invisible bombers, and seaborne planes on 11 self-contained carriers to deliver 4.5 acres of sovereign America anywhere the president wants it, and we don't need anybody's permission. We're a well-trained and disciplined force that is equally adept at liberating the oppressed, as we are defeating the oppressors. The world might love to badmouth us, but brother, they enjoy our protection. Half the world's landmass have security treaties with us. The duly elected governments of Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo, Korea, Kuwait, Germany, and Georgia invited us there. In the past 10 years, the youngest generation of American veterans have overthrown 2 enemy regimes and facilitated the stand-up of indigenous governments, guarded the 38th parallel in Korea, monitored Russian, Chinese, Iranian, Syrian nuclear weapons and other assorted hijinks, kept the sea lanes open, rescued American merchant seamen from pirates, and sent the architect of 9/11 to his maker. They have also responded to disasters large and small, including those of biblical proportions, in Louisiana, Mississippi, Myanmar, Pakistan, Sumatra, and New Jersey. And as of a couple of days ago, throw the Philippines in there. Never in the annals of human history has a nation existed like ours, possessed of such military dominance, such supremacy, such absolute lethality, and acted with such restraint. Why? Why? I think it's a pretty interesting question. Since World War II, the American military forces are symbols of liberation, freedom, and peace, not conquering and not occupation. Our military is motivated, intelligent, and composed entirely of volunteers. The active duty population, less than 1% right now, and currently less than 8% of our 300 million Americans are veterans. But those small numbers still don't answer the question. As military members, our customer is the American people, and that is you, the taxpayer. Civilization is the intelligent management of human emotions, and that is the answer. Intelligent management and our motto has it right. I suspect of all the worries you lay down with at night, the worry that your military is going to march up 395 and take over the seat of government is not one of them. We take orders from America, not give them. And students of history will be quick to point out that within the lifetimes of the people in this room, the people of Germany or Japan or Italy or Burma or Syria or Egypt or Venezuela, etc., were or are not so fortunate. So, when you dutifully pay your taxes with minimum complaint, oh, wait a minute. Actually, complain as long as you want. Assemble in the town square to protest. Write a letter to your newspaper. Fire your congressman, please. Change the law or run for office yourself. But when you finally do pony up your taxes, know this. I am honoring the inescapable reality that you, the American taxpayer, American citizens, are wrapping the young men and women of your military in the colors of this country. When necessary and when you direct, they will go to foreign shores and they will commit violence in the name of the American people in pursuit of freedom, security, and peace. And that is an act of the highest trust. You are serving by contributing to the stability, to the national and international confidence in a system, while far, far from perfect, is still the world's best model for peace and freedom. So, for my 30 years, 4 months and 8 days of service in the world's best Navy, I thank you and I honor all of you this day, citizens and taxpayers. Thanks. Thank you.
Question and answers. You can stay up for a couple of questions.
Sure.
Questions.
Sure. Easy ones.
Okay, I'll begin. As one of the Navy's earliest female aviators, what barriers did you face with regard to having to assimilate into a predominantly male culture without losing your sense of identity and self?
Wow. The first thing is you got to get over the cringe when it says, as one of the earliest pioneers, as a middle-aged woman, you hate to admit having done anything for 30 years. I will tell you, I think that, and this is a very interesting thing I've looked back over my life. The biggest glass ceiling that I had was in my own head. Biggest glass ceiling was in my own head. My recruiter actually said, are you interested in testing for flight school? And I said, no, I know nothing about airplanes. I'm not even a science major. I have a degree in economics. No, I'm not smart enough to be a pilot. Then, of course, I met some pilots. I'm not making a joke, and I am not trying to be cute. I went to my first duty station on an Air Force base. I'm living in the BOQ. I'm looking at these other schmoes running around in flight suits, and I'm thinking, holy cow, I'm as smart as these clowns. I can do this. But that I was the first glass ceiling internally. And it was a different time. 3 things have happened since, the prehistoric ages and after the dinosaurs died and I was in flight school. And 3 things have happened. 1, the system has changed. The organization has changed. I was a mid-grade lieutenant commander when it was still okay for somebody to march into the operations officer who writes the schedule and say, I don't fly with women. I mean, the system was what it was then. So that's changed. The women have changed. This generation of young women doesn't know a world where that existed for the most part, and that's a good thing. And the men have changed. Our sons, my 27-year-old son, if I went and told him that I wasn't, in fact, I told him one time I wasn't allowed to play Little League Baseball. And he looked at me like, what planet are you from? We've raised generations of kids that are smarter about this stuff. So I think that, to answer your question, it was just, the times have changed fast. And before we get too nostalgic about the good old days, some things about the good old days weren't that good. And those are some of the things. So I also... was blessed with complete ignorance about what flying was all about. And I mean that in the sense that I had no fear because I didn't know enough to be afraid. And that was a good thing. That was a good thing. Does that answer your question, Millie?
Yes,
Sure.
thank you. Any other questions?
Hey, good afternoon, ma'am.
Hi.
I had a shipmate. I was on the USS Nassau LHA-4 in 2003. I was ship's company. And I had a shipmate that fell off the side of the ship. His name was Dwayne Williams, ABF-3. It was on World News. When the ship came about, we had man overboard. When the ship came about, we lost his body, and his body was never recovered. He was a good friend of mine. And from that, hence, I became a water survival instructor. I worked for Naval Aviation Schools Command in Pensacola, Florida.
You bet.
So that was kind of an impetus for me to do that. But my question is, that event made me a little jaded, a little different, but also appreciative of life. So my question to you is, what advice would you have for employers that employ veterans now, and I'm of that OEF group, that see us as employers that may be biased or jaded towards us because of some of the situations that we've seen? So what advice would you have for employers now? Because some of them are fearful of veterans that we come with a certain stereotype, I guess you could say, and I'm sure you can relate.
I can. And it's an outgrowth of a good thing. Because what we started to do was realize that we were putting our veterans, particularly our war veterans from Afghanistan and Iraq, under these extraordinary circumstances, and we need to give them time to acclimate back. We need to give them services that they might need. Particularly, we still don't quite know exactly what concussions do to people. We don't even know that in football, much less in our warrior heroes. But to your question, I think one of the things I would tell employers is, you better understand something about your 25-year-old veteran that's different than your 25-year-old average. Forgive me if I call you a kid, but when you're my age, you get away with that. But your average 25-year-old. These guys and gals have been through such extraordinary experiences, even if they've never seen combat. Just the training alone that they've been through will give them a different insight to things, and it will, in some ways, give you a real jump start into acclimating them into particularly roles of leadership. Do you remember when the Snowden guy gave away all the secrets? And I was listening to the media saying, how is it that a 29-year-old has all these vast secrets? And I was like, well, that's somebody that's never been in the military. If he thinks 29 is young. I mean, 29, we got 29-year-olds flying bazillion-dollar airplanes and driving ships and doing all sorts of extraordinary things. So to an employer, I would say, sit down first and ask questions about the experiences that your veteran has had, and then try and leverage them, particularly in the leadership department. They may not have the proficiency in the civilian world, especially if they came out of like combat arms. It doesn't necessarily translate in terms of job skill, but leverage that leadership. Leverage that leadership. And while we are concentrating on helping our veterans that are having trouble transitioning with PSD and that sort of stuff, that should not characterize this generation. That is a terrible disservice to veterans in general. That's like characterizing all Vietnam vets as crazy baby killers. We should not do that. If they need medical services, we get them, destigmatize it. So to you, thank you for your service. You would have been the guy that came in the water after me, so thanks. Anybody else?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Captain Baetzel, for that very informative and enlightening presentation. Let's give her another round of applause. I also want to thank everyone who participated in our 2013 Veterans Day program.